Lionel Balder. Suddenly, she snapped out of it, straightening her shoulders and mustering all her composure. Thank you. I just tripped. With a grateful nod, she quickly descended the stairs, not daring to look back. Lionel followed her with his eyes, still feeling something off about her demeanor. As she rushed down the stairs, she seemed almost wild, as if fleeing some unseen danger. When she stumbled, Lionel's reflexes kicked in, and he caught her by the shoulder to steady her. As he gazed down at his hand, he noticed how delicate and slender her shoulders were, barely able to support her. His palms tingled as if burned, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. The distorted and disheveled bare face of the Empress, who always presented herself with only a flawless figure, remained in Lionel's mind like an afterimage. She was the one who laughed so hard, Lionel thought to himself. Adele arrived at the Empress Palace. She was angry at what had happened, but the tears wouldn't stop. She soaked herself in the hot bathtub, rubbing off the makeup on her face and washing her body for what seemed like an eternity before muttering to herself. As she closed her eyes, she imagined her old nanny and her wrinkled eyes curved like the moon. Whenever Adele did something against her mother's opinion, she clung to her nanny for comfort. Tell me, Nanny, what should I do? She muttered to herself. Her nanny's voice echoed in her mind. Walk on your own path. Your Highness. Do what you want. But remember to be modest about the results. Since that's the fate people like you have to endure, Your Highness, and the world is a place capable of changing people you. Empress thought, I must develop my own power independently of the Emperor's power. Your spouse is out of luck, her mother's favorite fortune-teller had told Adele. Princess Adelaide was lucky to be born. Her spouse's luck is greater than her parents' luck, and her child's luck is great. Alas, of course your parents are very lucky. Adele clicked her tongue and shook her head, finally muttering bitterly, Look, he's a complete quack cheater. Next morning, Mrs. Kix thought, the Empress returned to the palace last night, her face ashen. It caused Mrs. Kix's heart to skip a beat as the already pale countenance became even paler. Mrs. Kix had served as the general manager of the Imperial Palace for a long time. Although she no longer had influence over the ladies-in-waiting, her former colleagues remained in the palace, rushing to them. She inquired about what had happened, and she heard the entire account before dawn. She already looked unwell when she left the Emperor, and Diane Poitiers insulted you properly to make matters worse. The Minister of Defense caught her almost falling down the stairs, they informed her. Mrs. Kix was concerned that Adele might become ill due to her condition, but her worries were unfounded. Eat slowly, Mrs. Kix advised. The Empress nodded, but she continued to eat without pausing. Then an attendant arrived. What is it? Mrs. Kix asked. The attendant bowed politely and presented to the supplementary budget you mentioned earlier. The emergency budget supplementary has been completed, and I would like to ask you to review it, he said. Mrs. Kix quickly retrieved the envelope from the attendant and handed it to Empress. All eyes in the room were fixed on the Empress's expressionless face. Where did this document come from? Did the Emperor send you? No, Your Majesty. I am from the Ivory Palace. The Ivory Palace. They seem to have their hands in everything, the Empress remarked. She thought, I might get indigestion despite eating well. I never imagined that an emperor would entrust a concubine with the supplementary budget for the Empress's palace. It is a rarity to witness such an event in the present day. Wait here for a moment, have a servant escort him to a waiting room, and I will call for him later, the Empress ordered. Yes, Your Majesty, I understand, the attendant replied, relieved. The Empress raised her head and asked from Mrs. Kix, Do I have the authority to review the details of the total budget for the Imperial Palace? She inquired. Yes, Your Majesty, Giggs replied. I want to see it, please retrieve it for me, the Empress instructed. Mrs. Kix respectfully bowed her head, understood, Your Majesty. Adele perused the booklet containing the entire Imperial Palace budget and inspected the section allocated for the Empress's palace. Just how much was the written amount for you to do this, Your Majesty? She asked. Empress gave Mrs. Kix's letter. Check it. What on earth is this amount? Adele asked, passing the paper to Mrs. Kicks. The emergency supplementary budget amounted to no more than what was required to purchase a single horse. Adele examined the total budget that Mrs. Kicks had presented with a cold, calculating gaze. Based on my common sense, the amount assigned to the Ivory Palace should also be granted to the Empress's palace, Empress said. Mrs. Kicks hesitated and said, but Ivory Palace budget exceed the limit. Its budget is even higher than the Empress Palace. Scene shifts. The attendant arrived at Ivory Palace. Diane Poitiers calmly nodded her head, as if she had anticipated the situation. So you are telling me to allot the Empress Palace's budget again? Attendant nervously replied, Yes, Your Highness. Mistress. All right, let's begin. I'm not sure if this will satisfy you, she said. But, didn't you just say? The attendant began to protest. Will it take you half a day to get it? Take it to her at once. Right now, immediately, Diane interrupted. Realizing the urgency of the situation, the attendant hastily accepted the envelope. I will go and retrieve it immediately. Right now, the attendant said. You came back so soon. Does this mean that the Ivory Palace has the authority to allocate the supplementary budget? Adele questioned, trying to make sense of the Emperor's decision-making process. The Empress followed through with the amount indicated on the second memo, but she trotted away the paper in frustration. She then ordered the attendant to return. Fine. You may go now, she said dismissively, causing the dejected attendant to shuffle out of the Empress Palace with drooping shoulders. Ah, felt bad for this guy, caught up between them. Meanwhile, the poor servant, who was being tossed back and forth, ran over to Diane and bowed his head. The Empress wants me to do it again, the servant said. It seems that the Empress wants to spend extravagantly despite being given enough funds. Tisk tisk, how typical, she said. Yes, my lord, a nearby lady-in-waiting quickly agreed, bowing her head. You've done well, you're free to go, she said. Diane dismissed all but Lorraine, then put on a modest dress, wiped off her makeup, and secretly ordered Lorraine to do the same. Now go to His Majesty and tell her that the Empress has summoned me for a supplementary budget, and be sure to tell her that I'm trembling with fear, Diane instructed. Her lady-in-waiting replied, Yes, Your Highness. Shall we go catch the black beast? Mistress said. Meanwhile, at the Empress Palace, Adele, who had been scouring through the archives, fortunately stumbled upon a clue shortly after. Yes. The Empress has the exclusive right to decide on the acquisition of a residence in the Imperial Palace. There was such a clause. It's written in the book. Even though the authority of the supplementary budget revision is solely under the Emperor, isn't this clause completely in my favor? But you must be careful. The Imperial Palace law is a double-edged sword. If you want to wield it, you must be willing to be bound by its rules. Mrs. Giggs warned. Adele smiled and gestured to the trash can. Look at me, asking the Emperor's mistress to increase the budget even though I'm the Empress and she raised it by a single silver bar. Can you believe it? The double-edged sword was wielded by the Emperor first. I've already shed enough blood, so to speak. I understand, Your Majesty. Mrs. Kicks smiled softly. There is no room for objection. What can I do to reverse a decision that has already been made? If you want to withdraw a document that you've approved, you can retrieve it and issue a new order, Mrs. Kicks explained. Adele smiled at the answer. Her golden eyes shone like the moon. She turned to her advisor and whispered, Madam, please obtain a residence permit for Diane Poitiers from the Ivory Palace. Mrs. Kicks bowed respectfully. I understand, Your Majesty. It looked like someone is going to be homeless, hee. Empress Adele considering the various sources of power, family connections, that's irrelevant, she declared. Producing an air. Memories of someone's unwanted advances flashed in her mind, and she shook her head vehemently. That's not an option right now. She rejected the first two options without hesitation. That left two options. Relying on aids or building an independent power base. Adele had initially intended to focus on building a strong relationship with the Emperor before considering these options, but recent events had hardened her resolve. The supplementary budget from the Ivory Palace had made it clear that she needed to take matters into her own hands. Adele raised her pen again to write another verse. A drop of ink from the pen's tip fell, creating a black mark, but Adele didn't flinch. She turned her head with a stern gaze and looked out the window. A faint tremor, like a tingling sensation, passed through her from head to toe in the blink of an eye. The dormant magic that had been within her veins and deep inside her body reacted to something. It couldn't be. Adele muttered, gazing at the sky with a perplexed expression. Just then, her lady-in-waiting entered the room, announcing the arrival of a visitor. "Your Majesty, Diane Poitiers wishes to see you." Adele raised an eyebrow in surprise. Despite sending an attendant, the visitor had still made the effort to come to her. After a moment of consideration, Adele gave her approval. "Take me to the drawing room." As Adele entered the drawing room, "Your Majesty the Empress," the lady-in-waiting announced. "Did you bring the answer to the matter of sending the attendant personally?" she asked. "Yes, Your Majesty the Empress." "That's correct," Diane replied. As the Empress continued to stare at her, Diane politely asked, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty the Empress. What are you upset about?" Adele managed to keep her composure. "What am I upset about?" Adele asked. "Yes," Diane replied. Diane tilted her head with an innocent expression. Mrs. Kicks gave Empress budget information. Empress asked from Mistress to take look of Ivory Palace budget. "Your Majesty the Empress, with all due respect, why are you showing me these things?" Diane asked. She thought, "It seems she is finally using her position as Empress to pressure me. However, do you think it will be that easy, especially when she lacks His Majesty's affection and any of the noble support?" Mistress was assured that Empress can't do anything. "There is something I want to ask you," the Empress replied. "What is it?" Mistress asked. "Why are there no usage details in the total budget of the Ivory Palace?" the Empress inquired. Diane fell silent, taken aback by the question. The Empress continued, "Is it for consumables, salaries, or VIP entertainment? All other institutions have usage histories. However, why does the Ivory Palace budget is only place which without any usage details written, not the amount paid and spent detail mentioned?" It was an unexpected inquiry. "Perhaps you have the answer. But why are you asking about the Ivory Palace budget?" At Diane's question, Adele tilted her head with a genuine smile on her face. "That's because the amount allocated to the Ivory Palace has to be transferred to the Empress Palace." While staring at his paperwork, the Emperor noticed the lady-in-waiting enter the room. He instinctively sat up, knowing that it was usually bad news when Diane sent one of her direct maids. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Your Majesty, the princess has been summoned to the Empress Palace," the lady-in-waiting replied. Carl's face was furrowed in confusion. Why would the Empress summon Diane? The princess submitted a budget proposal, but Her Majesty rejected it twice. When she went to the Empress Palace to discuss it, she was so frightened that she came to seek Your Majesty's guidance instead. Please forgive her impertinence, Your Majesty. The Emperor felt a wave of anxiety wash over him at the mention of Diane's fear. The sensation of a giant strangling him tightened in his chest. The darkness seemed to swallow him up. Memories of the past echoed in his mind. "Someday, when you become emperor, will you accept me as your mother?" Carl bit his lip hard and placed his hand on his forehead. Diane blinked in surprise at Adele's announcement. "The budget for the Ivory Palace is being transferred to the Empress Palace," she repeated. Adele smiled at her with a puzzled expression, crossing her legs as she reclined on the sofa. "Well, you have been taking on the Empress role, haven't you? That budget was allocated to you for that purpose. As I am now handling the Empress affairs, The budget should naturally be transferred along with it. Does that upset you? Diane remained silent as Adele leaned in, her golden eyes shining. You have put a lot of hard work into it. I won't ask you to submit a statement of use for it now. I can handle that. Just transfer all the allocated budget to the Empress Palace. It seems that the Emperor has given you that authority. Mistress thought. Empress did not make a proposal or request. She did not even wait for the Emperor to grant her authority. As the Empress, even without family or allies to support her, she had the power to command. With a single order, Diane had to surrender her rights that she had taken for granted for 3 years. She had no title in the imperial palace, and this fact made her angry. She had prepared for this moment for so long. But reality was still different from her imagination. Her whole body boiled with anger. Her eyes were red, and her face turned red with fever. Adele's expression was also frosty at the sight of Diane trembling with anger instead of accepting her forgiveness. She asked, "Are you upset?" But Diane, still lost in her thoughts, and tears kept falling from her eyes. This palace, this drawing room, the place beside His Majesty, the position beside him as a sovereign that could look down on all people, those were all mine. Those were all supposed to be mine. They're mine. Adele remembered her past self in those tears. Step down from the heir position, Adelaide. Her mother's words. I lost my position so easily. Just from simple words. Do you think your place is gone because of me? She asked from Diane, but Diane did not answer. I am the Empress of Emont. Don't you dare challenge my authority. I will not forgive anyone who challenges the Empress's authority in any way. Do not think that she is taken away. Let her think well of what you originally had. Empress thought. Diane should not challenge the authority of the Empress. However, Adele was willing to offer Diane the best she had. This was the ultimate consideration for Diane. Diane clenched her fists tightly and glared at Adele. Diane had said that she would acknowledge everything except the Empress authority, but to Diane, even the Empress authority had long since become a part of her. It was hers. So Adele's proposal was wrong from the start. Her jaw trembled from how hard she clenched her teeth. Where is His Majesty? Why don't you come? Your Majesty, Diane muttered. And just then, the door to the Empress parlor was suddenly opened violently and without warning. Adele frowned and glared at the door, wondering who dared to open the Empress parlor door without permission. But then she saw Diane suddenly fall on her knees in front of her and cry out in a voice mixed with tears. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. It was sudden and simultaneous. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. Please forgive me. Adele was embarrassed and involuntarily opened her mouth, widening her eyes. What is she doing now? Meanwhile, Carl's gaze was on Diane, who was lying on the floor. Disheveled blonde hair on the floor, a small, slender back, and a quivering tone. Carl slowly raised his eyes and looked at the Empress sitting in her chair. Empress, what are you doing now? There was deep anger and darkness in Carl's low-pitched voice. Wake up, Lady Poitiers. What are you doing? Talk to me now, Adele exclaimed. Empress, what is Your Majesty doing right now? Emperor asked. Carl gritted his teeth and stared at Diane, then looked back at the Empress. Escort Diane to the Ivory Palace, the Emperor commanded. Yes, Your Majesty, the servant replied. Everyone, please leave. I need to have a private meeting with the Empress, the Emperor instructed, and the ladies-in-waiting promptly left the room. It's been a long time, the Emperor greeted coldly, to which Mrs. Kix politely bowed her head. You look the same, the Emperor continued, sitting next to the Empress. I just watch as those weaker than her are trampled on. Is that fun? Adele, not understanding the situation, gave a sharp command to Mrs. Kix to leave, but the Emperor raised his voice even louder. Is that fun? he bellowed. Mrs. Kix, please leave, Adele shouted back, unfazed. The emperor glared at her with a deadly gaze, and she returned the look, tightening her chin. Mrs. Kix calmed her trembling breath, bowed politely to the two of them, then turned around and left the room. What are you doing now, Empress? The emperor asked. What are you doing, Your Majesty? Adele replied. Is it fun? Grabbing someone weaker than you by the neck and twisting them to make them beg for help is in bad taste. I've never done that before, Adele insisted. I saw it myself, and it sounds like an excuse, the emperor retorted. As soon as the door opened, she collapsed and started begging me, just in time for Your Majesty's arrival. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence? The emperor jeered at Adele. Adele let out a sigh and ran her fingers through her hair. Meanwhile, the emperor lifted the ivory palace budget off the table. Do you desire this? Do you want what Diane has? It's not Diane who lacks self-control. It's you, Your Majesty. Have you even looked at the budget plan for the Empress Palace? What happened to the budget supplement? Don't you know, it was also entrusted to the Ivory Palace, an empress who receives money from the emperor's mistress. Is that what you wanted? Adele laughed bitterly and continued speaking rapidly. Roughly, she pulled out the discarded supplementary budget statement and laid it on the table. This is the supplementary budget for the Empress Palace. Let's take a look. I wonder if it's even worth a horse. Is the supplementary budget for the Empress Palace so destitute that it's comparable to splitting expenses with a group of courtesans? The emperor squinted as he gazed at the budget proposal from the empress. As Adele had said, the supplementary budget was only enough to cover the cost of a stallion. Is that why you summoned Diane? I instructed her to revive the budget, and she came of her own accord. That's what you call it, Emperor said. Is that so? As Adele replied in an exasperated tone. Carl's eyes glinted menacingly. Slowly, he approached her. Like the previous night, the two of them locked gazes with a precarious distance between them. Your mother lied to mother. They said she was an obedient and devoted daughter. Has she not realized anything since she was banished from her motherland? The emperor asked. Don't say anything about the reasons why I had to leave Gotrov without knowing them properly, Adele replied. Listen carefully, Empress, Carl said as he grabbed Adele's shoulders tightly, like a feather on a quill, like flowers in a vase. It was a mechanical answer to someone's question about who the Empress of Emont was. Suddenly, there was a loud noise that shook the palace. Flashes of light and echoes filled the air, and in an instant, Adele quickly ran to the terrace, and as she opened the door, the wind hit her whole body. She held onto the railing and raised her head to the sky, screaming. Suddenly, chaos erupted in the palace. A black catastrophe, like death itself, was running fast toward the Emont Imperial Palace. Adele stared at it with an unwavering gaze, like a feather on a quill, like flowers in a vase. Will you live like that? She repeated what the emperor had said. Mrs. Kix rushed in, her face betraying her surprise as she shouted, Your Majesty, are you okay? They say the tower is collapsing, and Her Majesty the Empress needs to evacuate immediately. No, absolutely not, Empress replied. The capital had issued an emergency order. The situation was dire, especially considering the tower was collapsing perilously close to the imperial palace. Chaos erupted in the palace like a hive of disturbed bees. An evacuation order was swiftly issued. Employees began to flee in droves. Amidst the commotion, Lionel Balder, the Minister of Defense and leader of the Knights, rushed towards the descending tower. Knights said it's looked like a 4-level tower. Lionel replied, Fortunately, it's descending on a garden. It would be harder to resolve if it landed on a building. Everyone, get in your positions. Maintain the line. When the tower reaches 50 feet above the ground, the magicians will come. Until they come, we need to block it. Understood, all knights answered. Lionel scanned his surroundings and asked, Are the magician coming? Not yet, Your Excellency, we've received no word, came the reply. Despite the tower's rapid descent, the magician had yet to appear. Lionel had seen this scenario play out before. They only emerged after enough knights had died. Go to the magician's official residence immediately and summon them, he ordered. Understood, sir. Upon Lionel's orders, the vice-captain swiftly turned and vanished. Individuals capable of freely using magic to combat the tower's magic were referred to as wizards. In Emont, the country's wizards were managed by the Imperial Magic Corps, which was a military force under the direct jurisdiction of the Emperor rather than the Ministry of National Defense. Wizards were mainly divided into two types: offensive wizards, known as strikers, and defensive wizards, known as keepers. The Imperial Wizard Commander was Duke Auguste Ulrich de Spun, and the Vice-Captain was Count Lennox Poitiers, who was a first-class striker and the top magician in Emont, despite being a commoner. His rank as an heritable count was well-deserved. Lennox Poitiers looked at Henri Jackal, the Vice-Captain of the Royal Guard, who had rushed over with a grim expression. So? Lennox asked casually as he buttoned up his robe, despite the Vice-Captain's fierce glare. You want me to come now? Henri Jackal spoke through clenched teeth. It's an order from the Minister of Defense. Assemble the wizards immediately in the Rose Garden where the tower is descending. Lennox chuckled and adjusted his crooked robes. Are you in trouble now? We're under the direct jurisdiction of His Majesty. We don't have to listen to the Minister of Defense's orders, you know. Henri Jackal gritted his teeth, and Lennox continued. Oh, my mistake. You're in a hurry. Fine, you go ahead. Despite his words, Lennox's movements remained leisurely as he adjusted his robes and checked himself out in the mirror. Henri Jackal clenched his fists tightly in frustration. Sir Jackal, did your salary not come through this month? If any of your subordinates are struggling financially, let me know. I can spare one of my gold leaf buttons for them, Lennox joked. Enough talk. Be ready, Henri Jackal warned, to which Lennox just laughed and moved closer to him. Henri Jackal, you can't go out like that. Do you need my help right now? The longer I delay, the more damage the knights will suffer, don't you agree? Lennox asked. The tower has descended upon the Imperial Palace. Do you think the wizards will be okay? The Imperial Palace magicians will not be able to avoid responsibility either, Henri replied. Lennox smiled and pulled out a gold-plated button from his pocket, dropping it at his feet. The button made a loud noise as it rolled around a corner. I don't care, he said. Henri was left speechless. Even if the magician are criticized later, I won't be. If the world were to turn into hell, it wouldn't matter to me as long as I'm not in that hell. So, Henri Jackal, don't insult me, because it won't end well for you, Lennox warned as he tapped Henry's shoulder and walked away slowly. Henri closed his eyes in frustration. Despite the humiliation, he knew that if the magicians did not come, the knights would be left to fight the tower alone, and the consequences would be catastrophic. He resisted his displeasure. With a deep breath, he politely bowed his head. And I seek the cooperation of the magician, Henri said, and Lennox couldn't contain his joy. Lennox's light blue eyes flashed in excitement. The black plague that descended from the sky was a blessing to him, and he relished the power it gave him over the aristocratic knight. As a massive tower plummeted towards the ground, a fierce updraft swept through the area, causing chaos and destruction. Have magician arrived? Lionel asked. No, they haven't, Knight replied. Lionel thought, in the end, they won't come on time again. The least I can do is try to protect more of my subordinates. Why are you just standing there? A voice came. Lionel was surprised by the unexpected voice, which seemed completely out of place in the chaotic scene. A gust of wind blew the woman's hair around her face as she skillfully tied it back. Your Majesty the Empress, Lionel gasped as Empress Adelaide suddenly appeared amidst the disaster. Dangerous. Go back, Sir Leopard, Lionel shouted, shielding the Empress from the gusts of wind that buffeted them. He was about to appoint one of his aides to escort her to safety when she finally spoke. Yes. Lionel wasted no time in delegating the task to one of his trusted men. Take Her Majesty and move to a safe place, now. Sir Leopard squinted at the tower, his gaze fixed on its trajectory. Why are there no magicians? Can't they destroy it before it reaches us? Or are they waiting for it to hit the ground? The Empress shot Lionel a questioning look, but he had no time to answer. Hurry, Your Majesty. It's not just the tower that poses a threat. Look out for the glass shards. Just as the glass shards were about to strike, something transparent appeared out of nowhere, intercepting them with a gentle push. They were swept away by the wind, leaving Lionel and the Empress unscathed. Magician? Lionel muttered, wondering if the wizards had finally arrived. Sir Lapat scanned the area, his eyes roving in search of the source of the mysterious force that had saved them. It's level 4, which is close to level 5, so there's no reason to wait, she said, her words confident and cool. Before Lionel could react, she began to run like a black panther towards the thunder and lightning. He followed closely behind, but as the Empress lifted herself into the air with an updraft, Lionel reached out to grab her shoulder. Adele clicked her tongue and pushed his hand away with magic. Don't worry, do not interrupt. As the Empress charged towards the tower, Lionel felt the magical power pushing him back. He looked up to see the Empress throw herself at the tower without hesitation. Before she had time to stop, Lionel stomped his right foot hard and propelled himself into her updraft. No! The knights cried, looking on in shock as Empress Adelaide flew into the sky, but Lionel quickly regained his senses, recalling the Empress's warning not to disturb her. She had been crystal clear. Prepare for the Empress to fall, Lionel said with a firm voice as he gazed at the towering inferno before them. We need to put out those flames before they consume the whole tower, Lionel commanded. Lennox nodded and immediately sent one of his wizards to do as he was told. Lionel then turned to the knights and said, Get ready to create a human chain. We need to get up there and save Her Majesty if she's still alive. The knights nodded and prepared themselves for the dangerous task ahead. As they were about to start their ascent, the tower shook violently, and a loud explosion echoed through the air. Lionel and the others looked up in horror as debris rained down on them. The tower was collapsing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it, he thought. A well-fitted training uniform sword attached to her back and the strong magic that pushed me. He remembered her chat with Count. A tower with spawning aerial monsters is classified as level 4. I'm sure she was saying that. Then, is it possible that Her Majesty? When I'm falling after removing a tower, the sight of the sky distancing in flashes, is a scene known only to me. She remembered her subcoordinate's words. Can you please stop doing that? What if you end up dying from it? Don't throw cold water on my hobby, Gibelline. Although it's a hobby that often lead to my apprehension. Now, shall we land gently? Adele said as she turned her body over to look at the ground, only to be taken aback by one of her men, arms outstretched in anticipation of her fall, his beautiful face radiating a resolute determination to catch her. Adele quickly conjured up her magic to slow her descent, causing Lionel to lower his arms as the Empress's fall decelerated considerably. The Empress descended slowly to the ground, as if descending from the heavens, with the halo of light and pale rose sky behind her. Lionel and Adele locked gazes. Did you try to catch me with your arms? She asked with a hint of amusement. I was planning on it, Lionel replied. Otherwise, my arms wouldn't be out like this. You are a knight using your arms. You might lose your arms if you do that, Empress said. All this time, I have had people who scolded me for this. No one had come rushing to her aid during her fall. Even if some had chided her for it. Anyway, thank you for your kind gesture. At her words, Lionel snapped out of his trance and watched as the Empress strode away. Wasn't she the one who had fled with a disheveled appearance just yesterday? How could she be so carefree and light-hearted after a single day? He could still feel the warmth of her slender shoulders in his hands. Lionel stared at Adele's retreating back, his palms still ablaze as they had been the previous night. He wasn't the only one unable to take his eyes off the Empress. Her entourage stood there. Put away your sword. It seems unnecessary, Adele instructed Lennox, who blinked in surprise. She then walked away, leaving him to ponder over her words. After a moment of silence, someone broke it with a hollow question that echoed through the ruined rose garden. Did Her Majesty the Empress really take down the tower alone? Now Empress Adele went back to her Empress Palace after defeating Tower Mrs. Kicks. She is worried for Empress and wonder how did tower suddenly disappear in thin air. Then she hears sound of footsteps. She turned around and saw Empress Adele came back. She asked, "Your Majesty, where did you go and from where did you got this dresses?" And she was worried about her. Empress Adele informed her that she went to destroy tower. Mrs. Kix gets startled. She asks what Your Majesty, but then suddenly Empress collapse on floor. Mrs. Kix panicked. Meanwhile, the nobility whispered rumors of a different ilk, their tongues wagging in hushed tones. "Do you mean to say that Her Majesty single-handedly destroyed the tower?" one noblewoman asked incredulously. "By the gods, are you implying that the Empress is a wizard herself? She flew into the sky and obliterated the tower with her own 2 hands. What madness is this?" one person said. "I know," people agreed with him. "Could it have been destroyed before the tower even touched the ground? And what does that make her? A striker, perhaps?" The Duke of Spun is undoubtedly attempting to enslave the Empress, but to think that she destroyed the tower all on her own. Is her class not higher than that of Lennox Poitiers? Strange indeed, agreed. And what if the Empress were to accept Duke de Spun's offer? To be subservient to a group that includes Diane Poitier's brother, Lennox Poitiers? What would that entail for their relationship? One person said, "Why would Gotrov send a princess, one who is such a powerful wizard, to Amont?" The group fell into a contemplative silence, mulling over the question at hand. Lionel pushed back the locks that obscured his eyes and gazed up at the clear blue sky. The memory of the fiery red hue that had adorned the heavens mere moments ago felt like a distant dream hallucination. The warm gusts of late summer wind stirred the air, carrying with them a handful of leaves that had prematurely shed from the trees of autumn. "It's level 4, which is close to level 5. So I don't have to wait." Her words echoed in his mind, crystal clear as if etched onto his brain. Lionel had tried to catch her as she fell, but all he had felt was the weight of her thin, fragile shoulders in his palms before her powerful magic had pushed him away. The sight of her was more overwhelming than any disaster he had ever witnessed. Flames that poured like molten gold, eyes that glinted with a fierce light that surpassed even the fire, and black hair that cascaded down like a waterfall. She is indeed an outstanding one. Meanwhile, Duke de Spun had rushed to the magician's official residence and burst through the door. He shouts, "Lennox!" At the sound of the Duke's voice, Lennox Poitiers quickly emerged. "Your Excellency, the Duke." Duke de Spun turned to Lennox and spoke in a hushed and urgent tone. "You are saying that the Empress is a wizard?" His face betrayed his anxiety and displeasure at encountering an unexpected twist. Lennox simply nodded. "That's correct." Duke asked, "Is it true that she destroyed the tower alone, without any other wizard's help?" Lennox hesitated for a moment before replying, "Yes, that's correct." Duke de Spun frowned and took a step back, mind working furiously to calculate the implications of this newfound knowledge. He spoke again. "The Empress is a wizard. She is an amazing person." Lennox, his confident demeanor shattered in an instant as he watched the tower collapse before his eyes. And then the impossible happened. The one who had single-handedly destroyed the tower was none other than the Empress herself. Lennox was taken aback. He had never imagined that the Empress, who had been married off to the Emperor as if she were a mere pawn, would turn out to be a wizard, let alone a striker. It was a revelation that would have caught even the Emperor off guard. "Truly remarkable. You are a great talent." The Empress Gotrov neglected to mention something rather important. Duke de Spun's voice was cold and grim, his long platinum hair sweeping across his face. Lennox couldn't shake off the ominous feeling that crept up his spine, causing goosebumps to form on his skin and beads of sweat to run down his back. Something told him that this was just the beginning of an unpredictable and perilous journey. Lennox wasted no time once the Duke had departed, sprinting towards the ivory palace with determination etched into his features. He barged in room and shouted, "Diana!" Diana, who was sitting in her room, looked at him and said, "Brother, how many times I have told you to knock on door." "Are you still not pregnant?" he asked, causing Diane to recoil. "Please, stop saying that. Do you think pregnancy is something that can be forced?" she exclaimed. What are you going to do now? Lennox demanded. What am I supposed to do? Diane retorted. The Empress is a wizard. Lennox snarled, his face contorted with anger. Diane's eyes widened in shock at the revelation. Is the Empress a wizard? She asked. Indeed, Lennox confirmed, and she's the one who caused the tower to disappear. Diane closed her eyes in dismay, unable to believe what she was hearing. It was all so unexpected, and she felt powerless to do anything about it. In that moment, she felt like nothing more than a mere puppet being pulled this way and that. She thought Empress Adele is mere puppet, and she can manipulate her. Duke de Spun said he was a great talent. What if he see me as worthless? Lennox asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Diane sneered at her brother's words, her anxiety mounting. If my brother was brought here, it's because he has potential, she replied. Stop doubting yourself and start protecting the wizards. I'll protect you. Nothing has changed. You have always been best mages in Emont. Don't waver. Get your HAED straight up and take care of Magic Division and I will take care of His Majesty. Lennox's expression softened at Diane's words, and he began to feel a sense of calm creeping over him. You're right, he said softly. Lennox nodded in agreement. And besides, even if you're not pregnant, the king is still wrapped around your finger, isn't he? He said, trying to lighten the mood. Stop saying that, Diane protested, and please be careful. Lennox grinned at her. Of course. You know me, he said, as they stared at each other. He said, of course after all Empress is alone what she can do. Diane's expression grew dark. We've endured so much already, only to be brought low by this. It's not fair, she said bitterly. She said, have faith, brother. Diane said, her voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate with power. It doesn't matter if the Empress is a wizard or not. In the end, we will be the last ones laughing. The world may take and take, but we will always have each other. Scene shift to Empress Palace. After defeating the monster tower without anyone's help, Adele is called bravado. The tower was the epicenter of magic, and its absence would cause the mana to dissipate, unleashing untold chaos. Adele pushed herself to the limit. She slept as if she were dead, groaning in agony as if her body had been battered. Mrs. Kix watched the Empress contort and make strange noises with a worried expression etched on her face. Though Adele's forehead didn't feel hot to the touch, Mrs. Kix couldn't shake her concerns. She left the room, knowing full well what the Empress was up to. And soon others learned of it too. The palace was in turmoil, abuzz with rumors of the Empress destroying the tower alone. Gossip and whispers spread like wildfire, and everyone seemed to be in on the secret. I said, she did it alone, someone exclaimed in disbelief. It's true. The guards are practically bursting with excitement. Another said, what about the other mage? Someone else asked. Late to the party. I heard the Empress arrived after the tower was already destroyed. Yet another voice chimed in. If not for Her Majesty, the royal guard would have suffered great losses, someone else added. Mrs. Kix quickly drafted a letter and handed it to one of her trusted aides. Take this to His Highness the Grand Duke immediately, she commanded, her tone brooking no arguments. Go quickly while chaos still reigns in the palace. As the Emperor stood lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the ominous black tower against the blood-red sky, the imperial palace suddenly erupted into chaos, but he remained calm, knowing that a tower of that size could be easily taken down. His aide informed him that the tower is coming, Your Majesty. Please hurry up and evacuate. Emperor replied, shut up, and stop making a big deal out of it. He thought it's a no big deal to take care to tower of that size. Perhaps he could order its destruction at the right time. As he pondered his options, a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if the wind had died down and the sky had faded to a lighter shade of red. And there, it was a brilliant white tower crumbling before his eyes. He thought, the wizards had done it. But the news that reached him soon after was nothing like what he expected. What? Who destroyed the tower? He asked. his voice barely above a whisper. "It is said that Her Majesty the Empress destroyed it alone," came the answer. The Emperor was stunned into silence. He stared down at his hand, still tingling from the shock of electricity that had coursed through it when he gripped the Empress' shoulder. All information he had been given was the gender and name of the late Empress of Gotrovas's daughter, but now he had to wonder. It is possible that the Empress Dowager of Gotrov had sent her daughter away to Ichmont because she couldn't handle the responsibility? Determined to find out the truth, he summoned the shadow responsible for his secret work. "Go to Gotrov," he commanded. "Find out about Princess Adelaide's track record." His aide bowed and replied, "I understand, Your Majesty." Scene shifts back to Empress Palace. Mrs. Kix came to visit Empress Adele and ask about her well-being. "Are you awake, Your Majesty? How are you feeling?" She saw Empress and her eyes widen. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the window, Empress Adelaide stirred from her slumber. The rumors about her latest decision had spread like wildfire throughout the city, and she knew it was time to take action. With a determined air, she ordered her attendants to stir up the still unquiet capital once more. "I shall issue an aid notice," she declared, her voice firm and resolute. Mrs. Kik's face instantly lightened up. Empress continued, "The eligibility criteria are unmarried men over the age of 20, except if they have a fiancé. The selection process shall be conducted through interviews, and the number of chosen candidates is yet to be determined." Mrs. Kix asked, "And what shall be the selection criteria, Your Majesty?" Adelaide paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Only my heart," she finally replied, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. Mrs. Giggs closed her eyes and bowed respectfully to the Empress, who smiled enchantingly, pleased with her faithful servant's response. The imperial capital's upper echelons were abuzz with the news of the Empress's call for aids. The mere act of recruiting assistants was enough to pique everyone's interest, but the fact that the Empress herself, a formidable striker who had shattered the tower just the day before, had issued the announcement had the nobles on the edge of their seats. Prince Baldur was no exception. "What is this announcement all about? Why the requirement is so simple?" Michael Rosen, the Duke's chief secretary, mused as he perused a single document, swiping back and forth over it. Theseus sighed, his shoulders drooping. He spoke, "It's actually better than a detailed one." "But, Your Grace," Michael pressed on, "don't you think this is rather vague?" Theseus rubbed his temples and pursed his lips. He said, "What's Her Majesty's intention? Is the Empress looking to challenge Her Majesty's rule or to establish her own power base against Diane Poitiers?" He pondered aloud. He looked up at his younger brother, Lionel, who was sitting across from him, his arms folded and eyes fixed on the announcement. "Lionel, what do you think?" Theseus called out to him, hoping to get his opinion. Lionel turned his gaze toward his brother, his deep blue eyes meeting Theseus's. "I don't know, I don't think it either. Or maybe she just wants to have some fun and pick someone she likes, because the selection requirement is someone I like," the Duke's secretary interjected. Theseus said, "Regardless, the Empress has put out a call for aids, and we cannot ignore it. Whom should we entrust with this task?" Secretary speaks. Who could be entrusted with the crucial task of serving as the Empress's aide, with the under attack from the Emperor? Finding a trustworthy individual to assist the Empress was of the utmost importance. The chosen candidate would need to meet a specific set of requirements: a close bond with the Baldur family, approval from the Empress, the ability to devise a plan to challenge the Emperor's power while serving as an aide, being an unmarried man over the age of 20 without a fiancé, and the fortitude to endure the inevitable loss of honor that comes with such a position, called Empress Lover. And that's why, for generations, the Empress aides have always been the second or third sons of powerful families. Breaking the silence, Lionel spoke out of turn. Her Majesty gave Count Calvin a gold bar. His Majesty must have been very displeased, he said, his words seeming to have no connection to the topic at hand. Perplexed, Theseus asked, What do you mean? Lionel. It's an aid notice from the Empress, Lionel replied, his voice steady and calm. Perhaps Her Majesty's view of the tower is different from the current wizards. Theseus asks, do you have someone to recommend? Lionel replied, I will apply for myself. Theseus gets startled. He replied, what? No, you should think again. Lionel asked from secretary, do you have someone suitable enough to recommend? I don't think so. Secretary replied, well, I think the 3 sons of Count Verdi are quite close in age. Theseus stated, nonchalantly, the youngest hasn't even reached 20 yet. Theseus began to protest. There's nothing for you to gain by going. The Empress is bringing in her aide to impress Her Majesty and to send a warning to Diane Poitiers. Everyone will talk behind you for being her lover. Lionel countered, as I have any honor left behind, to ruin it, we can't recede anymore. Just yesterday that Lennox Poitiers intentionally dawdled around to despise my order for backup. However, I can't complain about that at Magic Division, even though in the Minister of Defense. Theseus glared at Michael before Michael continued. Lionel has a point. We know very little about the wizards, towers, and witch beasts that are plaguing Emont. Even our attempts to steal information from other countries have failed due to it being a national secret, and we lost a person when we sent them to Gotrov. The Empress likely knows more than we do, and by becoming her aide, Lionel could gain valuable information to help us move forward. Theseus took a sip of his cold tea and furrowed his brow as he considered his brother's argument. Lionel continued, at least if I become the Empress aide, we can take a step forward. Theseus, please say yes so that these 2 lovebirds can be together and we viewers can be at peace. Theseus said, all right, the Empress aide. Theseus couldn't help but feel uneasy about the situation and lamented, if our mother were still alive, she would have slapped me for letting you do this. Lionel smiles and said, I will take it as you allowed me. Michael posed an important question. He said, sorry to interrupt you, but what if the Empress doesn't choose Lionel? I wonder why both of you are so confident about it. Both Baldir brothers gave Michael death stare. He nervously replied, of course, there is no reason still to reject you, it's Lionel Baldir after all. Please dress nicely when you go to Her Majesty. Scene shifts to Emperor Palace. As Diane gazed upon Carl, her heart sank at his preoccupation with her paperwork. It had been an entire day since their last encounter, which had taken place at the Empress Palace. Anxiety shimmered in Diane's cerulean eyes as she struggled to keep her composure. Cold sweat dripped down her spine, and she took a deep breath as chills coursed through her chest. Carl saw Diana's face and he suggested, if you're tired, you should go rest at the palace. You don't have to be here. She replied, I apologize for worrying you, Your Majesty. I heard that the Empress has issued an announcement to hire an aide. Diane said cautiously, choosing her words carefully. It hasn't been even a month since she got married, but now she is trying to hire one in less than a month. I can't help but worried it could be a problem for Your Majesty. Carl cut her off abruptly, his tone icy. It's nothing for you to worry about, just focus on your duties. Diane blinked in surprise, taken aback by the Emperor's dismissive tone, and he only met her with a cold gaze, leaving her feeling perplexed. She then turned around and said, Then now I will excuse myself, Your Majesty. Emperor said, take a proper care of the Empress Palace budget revision, so that no more commotion is caused from it. Hearing Emperor words, her steps unsteady, and tears streaming down her face. She felt a deep sadness, knowing that Carl was both her heaven and her hell. In this moment, she felt cast into hell by the Emperor's cold eyes, tone, attitude, and every word. It was all too easy for him to turn her world into a paradise, only to then plunge it into despair so painfully. I hope now she understand the difference between wife and mistress. As Carl sat in his chambers, his emotions roiled like crashing waves, threatening to consume him. He called his aide, order him, report to me the current situation about Her Majesty's aide recruitment. Aide replied, "Yes, Your Majesty." Then after few times Aide report him. Currently, there are 16 applicants. Baron Armand's firstborn. Viscount Belvet's. Emperor thought. It was only made this morning, yet the response has been swift and overwhelming. He couldn't help but smile wryly at the eagerness with which families sent their children to vie for the prestigious position of the Empress aide. He knew the Empress' magical prowess had drawn much attention, and he wondered how the dynamics of the court would shift with her new aide. He asked, "Is there anyone from Baldir family?" Aide replied, "Currently no one." Emperor said, "Report me immediately if you got any new news about it. There is no way Duke Valgier or the Minister of Defense will personally apply for it. Thus, they will send someone from a family related to them." Scene shifts to Empress Palace. Hannah Giggs, known for her encyclopedic knowledge, Hannah's insight was invaluable, and she didn't hesitate to share her thoughts, and that concludes my report introducing the core politics of each mont. Empress is amazed from Mrs. Kick's knowledge. She praised her. She said, "No wonder the lady favored you, you're indeed amazing." Mrs. Kicks replied, "I am grateful, Your Majesty." While looking at report, Empress said, "Considering the current circumstances, it would be wise to extend an invitation to the Balder family." Empress put down the report and said, "Anyway, now shall we start interviewing the applicants for my aide?" As the doors of the Empress Palace opened to officially begin the interviews, the nervous interviewers lined up to meet Her Majesty. First applicant arrived. He opened his mouth and said, "Your Majesty the Empress, the moment I met you, I couldn't believe my eyes. If there is an angel, this is it." "I thought so," gushed one of the candidates, overwhelmed by Adele's presence. "Me, an angel? My nickname was the Witch of Gotrov," Adele thought. Applicant 2. "It's such an honor to meet you, Your Majesty. I couldn't even look at your face, so I lowered my head and only saw the tips of your toes. I'm so nervous. This moment feels like a dream," stammered another candidate, struggling to contain their awe. "I feel like I'm in a dream too," Adele said, trying to keep her composure. Another candidate interjected enthusiastically, "I am really strong, Your Majesty." Another one said, "Your Majesty, my specialty is singing. Would you like to hear it?" Empress screamed in her thought, "No, please stop." After the last candidate left, Adele slumped onto the sofa, exhausted. She thought, "That's why paperwork is necessary for process. There isn't a single applicant who can understand my announcement meaning." She thought an applicant from Baldir family hasn't shown up yet. Mrs. Kick said to Empress, "If you are tired, should I send them back?" Empress replied, "It's almost over, isn't?" Mrs. Kick, "Yes indeed." Empress continued, "Please guide them in. I think it would be better to wrap things as quickly as possible and then rest afterward." Mrs. Kicks went outside and called next applicant. She was shocked. A man in a sleek black suit had entered, drawing everyone's attention. His jet black hair and piercing blue eyes caught the light, and the badge on his chest, featuring crossed swords and a black panther, demanded respect. It was Lionel Baldir. Now, my dear friends, I know you must be wondering why Duke de Spun is in charge of the magic division and why the Emperor wants his side. Actually, Duke de Spun is also a magician, and why he didn't fight against Monster Tower. His thinking is similar, like Empress Adele's mother, who wants to hold highest authority, and wanted to be seen as godlike figure among humans, and want to look down on everyone else. Well, now our manhwa ends here. Thank you, my friends, subscribing to this channel. I hope you understand my problem. Thanks for watching. If you want to support us, please check the description. Thank you again, my friends. Bye and take care.